American colonists inherited many of their political ideas from England, where Parliament limited the power of the monarchy and granted basic civil liberties to citizens. The majority of the people in the 13 British colonies that had become the United States were English. Thus, English political traditions shaped the colonists' views on government. The idea of limited government in England had its roots in the Magna Carta, a charter signed by King John of England in 1215 to settle a revolt by many of its feudal barons. This Great Charter, as it was called, laid out important ideas about limits on government. It declared that the government could not imprison a free man or seize his property except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Another important document in England's political heritage was called the Petition of Right. This 1628 document stated that the monarch could not impose taxes without Parliament's consent or imprison persons without legal cause, and that martial law could not be declared during peacetime. Parliament wrote the document and forced King Charles I to sign it in protest of what Parliament viewed as his abuses of power. Although Charles I and some later monarchs ignored these principles, they influenced American colonists' views of government, particularly regarding the power of government to tax. 6 decades later, in 1689, Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights, which established that people had basic civil liberties, such as the right to a fair trial and protection against excessive bail and fines, and against cruel and unusual punishment. Many of the provisions in the English Bill of Rights were incorporated into the U.S. Bill of Rights a century later. Importantly, there were many differences among the governments of the 13 colonies, but they were all guided by charters or written constitutions and had a colonial assembly elected by free men. The first elected colonial assembly to be established was the Virginia House of Burgesses, which first met in 1619. White male landowners elected the assembly, which represented geographic political districts throughout Virginia. The Pilgrims, for their part, had intended to settle in Virginia, but landed further to the north in what is now Massachusetts. Before leaving their ship, the Mayflower, the male passengers signed the Mayflower Compact. This historic agreement from 1620 was the first explicit plan for self-government in the colonies. The men pledged to become a civil body politic and abide by laws established for the colony. By the time of the American Revolution, each colony had an elected colonial assembly, a separate executive branch headed by a governor, and a system of courts. In the royal colonies, the king appointed the governor, who was chief executive of the colony and reported directly to the king. Royal governors had great authority in theory, but the vast distance from Britain and their dependence on colonial assemblies for funds limited their power in practice. Thus, much of the governing in the colonies was carried out by the colonial assemblies. Members of the lower house of colonial assemblies were the elected representatives of the voters in the colonies. The lower house had lawmaking powers, and along with the governor and the governor's council, the power to tax. The great distance from Britain and control over funds for the governor enabled colonial assemblies to exercise real political power. It was the assemblies that represented the will of the colonists.